This is a steel drum with a pipe coming out of it. You fill it with sticks, wood chips, or scrap offcuts, light it, and about 10 minutes later a flammable gas begins pouring out of that pipe. Feed that gas into an ordinary petrol generator, and the generator runs. No gasoline, no diesel, no fuel purchase of any kind. That is not a theory, and it is not a prototype. During the Second World War, more than 1 million vehicles across Europe ran on exactly this, because petrol was rationed or simply unavailable, and people needed to keep moving anyway. Trucks, buses, tractors, and family cars, all running on wood. And here's the honest part stated up front. And on this particular topic, I'm going to be more insistent than usual. The gas this machine produces is roughly 1/5 carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide has no color, no smell, and no taste. It gives you no warning of any kind, and it kills by binding to your blood far more tightly than oxygen does. People died operating these machines during the war, and people have died operating them since. That is not a reason to avoid the subject, since this technology is real, legal, historically enormous, and genuinely useful. It is a reason to treat it with more respect than anything else I've covered, and I will give the safety section the length it deserves rather than tacking it on at the end. Let me start with the chemistry, because the difference between this and a bonfire is the entire technology. When you burn wood normally, you give it plenty of oxygen. The carbon and hydrogen in the wood combine fully with that oxygen, and you get carbon dioxide, water vapor, and heat. The energy is released as heat, right there, and there is nothing left over. Gasification does something different. You deliberately starve the reaction of oxygen. With too little oxygen to burn completely, the wood cannot finish the reaction. Instead, it breaks down into simpler flammable gases, chiefly carbon monoxide and hydrogen, and those gases still contain most of the original chemical energy, so you have not released the wood's energy. You have converted it into a gas that can be piped somewhere else and burned later, in an engine, under control. That is the whole idea. Solid fuel in, gaseous fuel out, and the gas is what an engine can actually use. Inside the reactor, 4 things happen in sequence as the wood travels down through it. At the top, the incoming wood dries, since any moisture has to be driven off before anything else can happen. Below that, the wood pyrolyses, meaning your heat breaks it down into charcoal, tars, and volatile gases without any oxygen involved at all. Below that is the combustion zone, where a controlled amount of air is admitted and part of the material genuinely burns. This is not a mistake, since that burning is what generates the heat driving the entire process. And at the bottom is the reduction zone, where hot gases pass through a bed of glowing charcoal and the chemistry reverses. Carbon dioxide meets hot carbon and becomes carbon monoxide. Water vapor meets hot carbon and becomes hydrogen and carbon monoxide. That last zone is where your fuel is actually created, and it is why the charcoal bed matters more than anything else in the machine. What comes out is called producer gas, or wood gas, and it is roughly 1/5 carbon monoxide, roughly 1/5 hydrogen, a small amount of methane, and the rest inert nitrogen and carbon dioxide. That nitrogen is the reason for the single biggest limitation, and I will come back to it. It is worth knowing that the composition is not fixed, and that a well-run machine and a badly run one produce genuinely different fuel. A properly hot reduction zone with dry fuel gives you a gas rich in carbon monoxide and hydrogen, which lights readily with a clean, pale flame and runs an engine smoothly. A cool reduction zone, usually caused by wet fuel or too much air, produces far more carbon dioxide and water vapor, which are both inert along with unconverted tars. That gas lights reluctantly or not at all, and it is the reason experienced operators test the flame before connecting anything. So the flame test at the outlet tap is not a formality. It is the machine's own quality gauge, and it tells you in 2 seconds whether what you have made is fuel or just warm smoke. Now the history, because it is far larger than almost anyone realizes. The idea is old. Through the early 1800s, cities across Europe and America were lit by gas made from coal in exactly this way, and the gasworks was a standard feature of any town of size. Piping a manufactured flammable gas around a city is a Victorian technology, not a modern one. Applying it to engines came later, and the man who made it practical for vehicles was a German engineer named Georges Imbert, who, through the 1920s, developed the downdraft gasifier design that solved the problem that had stopped everyone else. That problem was tar. Wood pyrolysis produces sticky tars, and tar in an engine is fatal, gumming valves and rings within hours. Imbert's downdraft arrangement forces the gases through the hottest zone on their way out, which cracks most of those tars into simpler gases before they leave the machine. The Imbert geometry became the standard, and it is still the reference design today. Then came the war, and this is the part that stops people. When the Second World War began, Europe's oil supply collapsed almost overnight. Petrol was rationed to military use, and civilian transport simply did not have fuel. Wood, however, was everywhere. so Europe converted its vehicles. Estimates put the total at over 1 million producer gas vehicles in operation across the continent. Sweden, which had almost no domestic oil, converted on an extraordinary scale, running something in the region of 90,000 gasifier vehicles, which was most of its fleet. The Swedish case is the one worth studying, because they did it deliberately and systematically rather than in a panic. Sweden was neutral and effectively cut off, with essentially no petroleum of its own and enormous forests. So the state promoted gasifier conversion actively, standards were developed, manufacturers produced units commercially, and the country ran its civilian transport, its farm machinery, and a good deal of its industry on wood for the duration. That national experience is also why Sweden retained more institutional knowledge of gasification than almost anywhere else, and why a good deal of the serious post-war research on the subject came out of Scandinavia. It is a genuine case study in a developed country, substituting a domestic resource for an imported one at national scale, under pressure, in a matter of months rather than decades. Germany operated several 100,000. France, Denmark, and Finland did the same. Picture what that actually looked like. Buses with a steel cylinder bolted to the back, trucks with a gasifier on a trailer, family cars with a unit strapped to the bumper, and a driver who had to light his car 20 minutes before setting off. Tractors ran on it, generators ran on it, ships ran on it. An entire continent kept moving on wood because the alternative was not moving at all. What it was actually like to own one is worth describing, since it tells you more about the technology than any specification. You did not turn the key and drive. You went out to the vehicle 20 minutes early, opened the reactor, checked the fuel level, and lit it. Then you waited while it came up to temperature, and you tested the gas by holding a flame to a small tap on the outlet, since gas that lights cleanly with a pale flame is ready, and gas that will not light is not. Only then did you start the engine, and it started poorly, since a cold gasifier produces weak gas. On the road, the vehicle was slower and noticeably gutless on hills, because you had lost a third or more of your power. Drivers learned to take runs at inclines rather than change down halfway up. Every hour or two you stopped to refill the hopper with wood, and periodically you cleaned the filters and drained the condensate, which was a filthy job. And you carried the smell with you, since a gasifier vehicle had a distinct wood smoke odor that clung to clothing. That was normal transport for millions of people for the better part of 6 years, and nobody thought it was remarkable. It was simply what driving was in a continent with no fuel. And then the war ended, oil returned, and within a handful of years, essentially all of it was gone. Not because it failed, because nobody would choose to light a fire and wait 20 minutes when a petrol pump exists. That is the honest answer to why you have never heard of this, and it is the same answer as almost everything in this series. Convenience won, decisively, the moment convenience was available again. But the knowledge did not vanish entirely, and the reason is worth knowing. In 1989, the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency published a document titled, Plainly, a construction guide for a simplified wood gas generator for fueling internal combustion engines in a petroleum emergency. Read that title again. A federal agency, in peacetime, sat down and published public instructions for building a wood gasifier, specifically so that citizens could keep engines running if the fuel supply ever failed. That document is still publicly available, and it remains the most widely used reference for anyone building one of these today. Nobody buried this technology. A government agency wrote the manual and put it in the public domain. Now the deployment today, and it is genuinely alive in 3 places. The first is the off-grid and homestead world, where people with woodland and a generator run gasifiers to produce electricity from material they already have, particularly where waste wood is abundant and fuel deliveries are expensive. The second is small-scale power generation in parts of the developing world, where biomass gasifiers run village generators on agricultural residue, rice husks, and wood waste that would otherwise be burned in the open. The third is industrial biomass gasification, which is a serious commercial technology operating at utility scale, converting wood waste and agricultural residue into gas for power generation and heat. So this is not a lost art. It is a working technology that retreated from ordinary life and stayed everywhere else. This channel exists for exactly this kind of straight answer. One honest method a week, and subscribing is how those keep arriving. Now the arithmetic, and here's where you need honest numbers rather than enthusiasm. Wood gas is a weak fuel. Its energy content per volume is roughly 1/10 that of natural gas, and the reason is the nitrogen. Because you are feeding the reactor with ordinary air, and air is nearly 4/5 nitrogen, most of what comes out of your pipe is inert gas that contributes nothing and simply takes up space in the cylinder. The practical consequence is engine derating. An engine running on wood gas produces roughly 30 to 50% less power than the same engine on petrol. So a generator rated at 5 kilowatts on gasoline will realistically give you somewhere around 3 on wood gas, and it will be less responsive. The conversion itself is simpler than people expect, and that is genuinely part of the appeal. An ordinary petrol engine will run on wood gas with remarkably little modification, because the gas simply replaces the fuel-air mixture the carburetor would normally supply. In practice, you fit a mixing valve ahead of the intake, allowing you to blend gas and air and adjust the ratio by hand while it runs. Wartime conversions typically kept the petrol system intact and switchable, which meant a driver could start on petrol, switch to gas once the reactor was hot, and switch back if the gasifier faltered. That dual capability is what made the whole thing practical, and it is what most modern builders do as well. Diesel engines are a different matter, since they ignite by compression rather than spark, and cannot run on gas alone. They can run in dual fuel mode, drawing wood gas in with the air and using a small injection of diesel to trigger ignition, which typically displaces a large share but never all of the diesel. So the easiest project by far is an ordinary small petrol generator, which is exactly why that is what most people build for. On fuel consumption, the widely used working figure is that somewhere in the region of 2 to 3 kilograms of dry wood substitutes for about a liter of petrol, which means a serious appetite for wood if you are running continuously. Put those together for a household generator and you are feeding it several kilograms of dry wood per hour of operation, and somebody has to cut, split, dry, and load that wood. Which brings me to the number nobody mentions: moisture. Wood for gasification needs to be genuinely dry, meaning somewhere below about 20% moisture content, and ideally lower. Wet wood ruins the process entirely. Since the energy that should be making gas goes into boiling water instead, the reduction zone cools, and you get a weak, tarry gas that will damage your engine. That means seasoning, which means a woodshed, and a year of planning ahead. This is not a fuel you improvise on a wet afternoon. Size and uniformity matter almost as much as dryness, and this catches people who assume any wood will do. A gasifier wants fuel in fairly consistent pieces, typically somewhere in the region of an inch to a few inches, because the fuel has to settle down through the reactor evenly as it is consumed. Feed it a mixture of sawdust and large logs, and two things go wrong. The fine material packs down and chokes the airflow, and the large pieces bridge across the throat and leave a void beneath them, so the reactor runs hollow and the gas quality collapses. Wartime operators use carefully sized wood blocks, and modern builders use chipped or chunked material screened to a range. Charcoal, incidentally, works extremely well and produces cleaner gas with almost no tar, which is why some builders make charcoal first and gasify that instead, accepting the energy loss in exchange for a far simpler machine. That charcoal route is genuinely worth considering for a first project, since it removes the tar problem that ruins most beginner builds. Now the build, and here I am going to be more careful than usual. The parts list is genuinely cheap: a steel drum or a length of large diameter pipe for the reactor, steel pipe for the gas outlet, a cyclone separator, which is a cone that spins the gas to throw out particulates, a cooling section, often simply a length of pipe with fins or a radiator, since hot gas carries less energy per volume, and cooling it also drops out moisture and remaining tar, and a filter, traditionally packed with wood chips, sawdust, or fabric to catch what is left. Total materials cost genuinely can land in the region of $70 to $300 if you have access to scrap steel and a welder, which is where the figure in the title comes from. But the cost is not the barrier here, and I want to be plain about that. This is a fabrication project. It involves cutting and welding steel, building an airtight vessel that will run at high temperature, and getting the internal geometry close enough to correct that the reduction zone actually works. A gasifier built with sloppy dimensions produces tarry gas that will destroy an engine in a few hours of running, and the finished machine produces a lethal, odorless gas by design. So my honest advice is this: if you want to build one, work from the FEMA document or from one of the established published designs rather than from a video, follow the dimensions rather than improvising them, and treat it as a serious engineering project rather than a weekend build. Now the safety section, and this is the longest one I have written for any topic in this series, because it needs to be. Carbon monoxide is the entire issue, and everything else is secondary. It is colorless, it is odorless, it is tasteless. There is no sensory warning of any kind, which is exactly what makes it so dangerous, since every other hazard in this field announces itself, and this one does not. It binds to the hemoglobin in your blood far more strongly than oxygen does, which means it displaces the oxygen your body needs, and your blood stops carrying what it is supposed to carry. Early symptoms are headache, dizziness, nausea, and confusion. And the confusion is the cruel part, because the person affected frequently does not realize anything is wrong and does not act. Wood gas is roughly 1/5 carbon monoxide by volume, not a trace, a fifth. So the rules are absolute and none of them are optional. Never operate a gasifier indoors, in a garage, in a shed, in a barn, or in any enclosed or partially enclosed space. Outdoors, in open air with good natural ventilation, always. Never run a vehicle or generator fueled by wood gas inside a building, including with the door open, since an open door is not ventilation. Fit carbon monoxide alarms, plural, in any building near where you operate, and carry a personal CO monitor if you are working around the machine. These cost very little, and they are the only warning system that exists for a gas that provides none of its own. Never sleep near a running gasifier, and never leave one running unattended overnight. Understand that leaks are the common failure, since the whole system is under slight pressure or suction at various points, and a joint that weeps gas outdoors in a breeze is nothing, while the same leak in a shed is lethal. And know the symptoms, so that if two people working around a machine both develop a headache at the same time, everybody leaves immediately and gets into fresh air rather than debating it. Beyond carbon monoxide, there are 3 more genuine hazards. The reactor operates at very high temperature, and the external surfaces get hot enough to cause serious burns, so it needs shielding and clearance from anything combustible. The gas is flammable and can form an explosive mixture with air, which means no ignition sources near the machine while it is producing, and careful practice when lighting and shutting down. Purging procedures matter, and the tar and condensate that collects in the filters and cooling sections is genuinely nasty material, containing compounds that are known carcinogens. Wear gloves, do not let it soak into skin, and dispose of it properly, rather than pouring it on the ground. Now the honest limitations, which are considerable. The first is labor, and it dwarfs everything else. Someone has to cut, split, season, store, and load the wood, and then tend the machine while it runs. This is not a device you switch on. It is closer to keeping a fire going, because that is exactly what it is. The second is startup time, since a gasifier needs somewhere around 10 to 20 minutes from lighting before it produces gas clean and strong enough to run an engine. Wartime drivers genuinely lit their vehicles before breakfast. The third is engine wear, because even well-filtered wood gas carries more contamination than petrol, and engines running on it need more frequent oil changes and eventually show it. A poorly built gasifier will destroy an engine quickly, and a good one will still shorten its life somewhat. The fourth is the derating I have already covered, since you lose 1/3 to 1/2 of your engine's output. The fifth is fuel quality, meaning dry, uniform, correctly sized material, since a gasifier fed random wet junk will bridge, channel, and produce tar. And the sixth is that this makes no economic sense whatsoever if petrol is available and affordable. Nobody in normal circumstances should build one of these to save money, because the labor cost alone exceeds the fuel saving many times over. Which raises the obvious question of why anyone builds one at all, and the honest answer is the same one that applied in 1940. You build it for the situation where fuel is not available at any price. That is the entire proposition. This is not a cheaper way to run a generator. It is a way to run a generator when the pumps are dry, using material that is lying on the ground, and it is the reason a federal agency published the plans in the first place, for a property with woodland, a generator, and a genuine interest in being able to keep the lights on independently of a fuel supply chain. That is a meaningful capability. And there is one refinement that materially improves the case, which is capturing the heat. A gasifier and the engine attached to it both reject enormous quantities of heat, and in most home installations, all of it goes into the air. Route the gas cooler and the engine cooling through a water tank instead, and you are producing hot water and space heating alongside your electricity from the same wood you were burning anyway. Engineers call that combined heat and power, and it is exactly how industrial biomass installations justify themselves, since the electrical efficiency alone is unimpressive, while the total energy recovered is very good indeed. At household scale, that means a system feeding a generator, a hot water tank, and possibly a workshop heater from a single fire, which is a far better proposition than electricity alone. For everyone else, it is one of the most interesting pieces of engineering history you can read about and should probably not build. The ledger for the whole story, then. Steel drum and pipe for the reactor, free to $80 from scrap. Cyclone and cooling sections, $20 to $100. Filter housing and media, $20 to $50. Fittings, valves, and hose rated for the temperature, $30 to $80. Carbon monoxide alarms, $20 to $40, and those are the least optional thing on this entire list. Total, roughly $70 to $300 in materials, plus a welder, plus a great deal of care. Here's the thing worth keeping from all of it. In 1940, a continent lost its oil supply, and rather than stopping, it bolted steel drums to 1 million vehicles and ran them on sticks. Buses, tractors, trucks, and family cars on wood for years at national scale. Then the tankers came back, and within a few years, nobody could remember it had happened. That is worth sitting with, because it is the clearest example in this entire series of a capability that a society had used at enormous scale under pressure and then set down completely the moment it was no longer forced to carry it. The knowledge is not gone. A federal agency wrote it down in 1989, precisely because somebody understood that a thing which was needed once might be needed again. Everything this channel has gathered on making energy from what you already have, the engines, the stores, the trickle sources, each with its real numbers and its real limits, lives in one place, linked right below. And the comments are where this one earns its keep. Did anyone in your family ever mention a wood gas vehicle or a gasifier on a farm? Those stories are still within living memory in parts of Europe, and they are disappearing fast, and I would genuinely like to read them. As for the machine that moves water uphill forever with no fuel, no electricity, and only 2 moving parts, invented in 1796 and still manufactured today, that is on screen right now. Different problem, same century. Till next time.